Hi, I'm Randy Cantrell. Welcome to the Year of the Peer podcast with Leo Batari. This podcast is based on a simple truth. Who you surround yourself with matters. Author and keynote speaker Leo Batari will interview thought leaders from all walks of life who will share how they leverage peer advantage and show you how engaging your peers more purposefully can hold the key to greater success in business and in life. This week's guests are Etienne and Beverly Wenger Trayner. Etienne Wenger Trayner is a globally recognized thought leader in the field of social learning and communities of practice. He has authored and co-authored seminal articles and books including Situated Learning, where the term community of practice was coined, Cultivating Communities of Practice, and Digital Habitats, which tackles issues of technology, community, and what it means to be together. Beverly Wenger Trayner is a consultant specializing in social learning systems. Her work with international organizations such as Nuclear Threat Initiative, the International Labor Organization, and the World Bank have given her substantial experience in coaching conveners and in supporting multi-lingual groups across cultures, time zones, and geographic locations. She has published chapters and articles about learning in internationally distributed communities. Their most recent work together is introduced in their latest book, Learning in Landscapes of Practice. Let's get started, Leo.
Well, Etienne and Beverly Wenger Trayner, welcome to the Year of the Peer podcast. It's great to have you here today.
Hi, Leo. Yeah, hi.
It's wonderful. Well, look, one of the things that I would love to get started with right now, because it's you're so rich in this topic and there's so much, I think, to cover. But I would love to, I think, set the stage first by having you talk about communities of practice. One of the wonderful things that I was so impressed with was that you gave language to something that has been going on for a very long time, but I think you gave us a mechanism to be able to talk about it. So if you could tell us how that came about and then define communities of practice for us, I think that would be great.
Well, it started really more as an observational concept. It was not a technique in the beginning. It was just something that we observed by doing studies of learning in natural settings. And we noticed that people form these informal communities around things that they need to learn how to do together. It started with studies of apprenticeship. We had a master and then lots of apprentices around that master, and then people learning from each other in a process, and we gave it the name community of practice. It's only later that people say, that's an interesting way of learning. Could we use this as an alternative to the classroom, since it's a way that people have learned together forever, since the beginning of the species, pretty much. We were doing communities of practice to learn how to do the hunt, to maybe learn how to pick berries or what have you. So this notion that human practices is something that people develop together to be successful at whatever they want to do is something that is not new at all. But probably what happened is that the institution of schooling has kind of appropriated the idea of learning in such a way that for many people that's the only way they can think about learning. But if you look at a group of engineers in a company discussing a problem, how to solve it together, or if you think of a street gang, trying to learn how to sell more drugs and kill, are very fundamental to human nature.
So it's fair to say, though, that you actually went in studying this relationship between kind of the master and the student, or the master and the apprentice, only to kind of discover how much the students and these apprentices learn from one another, correct?
That's right, yeah. But then, it's also fair to say that was where we got the idea. But then we found a lot of places where there's no one master. It's more a kind of general partnership among people. You see what I mean? So,
sure.
So the idea was first coined in the context of a place where there was a clear master, and then a lot of apprentices. And yes, indeed, apprentices learning from each other and forming a kind of community. But, you know, a lot of the communities of practice we deal with currently, nobody knows the answer. It's not like there's a master who knows and the others are trying to gain that, although that happens too, you know?
Sure.
It does happen too, but the best use of communities of practice today is when a group of people face situations for which there is no given answer. They need to learn what they don't know yet, not what is already known. You see?
Sure. So, but in terms of communities of practice, though, you do have kind of three aspects of communities of practice that create communities of practice, starting with the domain. If you could talk to us about those three elements, that would be great.
Well, I mean, it's more a definition. So yeah, you have a domain because a community of practice is about something. People have to know who is a good learning partner for me, because they share an interest, they share a need to learn about something that's in common. You know, otherwise it's just a conversation around beer. You know, and it's fine. You know. But if you want to really make progress, you need to make sure that the person you're talking to has some appreciation for the challenge and why it's important to learn how to solve it, and that they can apply it in their own practice, you see? So
sure.
That's what we call the domain. The domain is that sense of shared identity around something hard that we need to know how to do in practice.
You know, and Beverly, you've talked about communities of practice, not only in terms of simple knowledge sharing, but it's really about experiences and sharing those experiences as well. Do you want to tell us a little more about that?
Well, yes, I'm not sure about sharing experiences. I mean, it's more about, as Etienne said, it's more about being with other learning partners who understand. I mean, when you look at a learning, you know, when you see somebody who's shared the same sort of life experience as you have, or the same experience around work as you have, there are certain sort of shortcuts, and there's certain things, you know, that you can say to them, which you can't say to other people without a lot of explanation.
Right.
And so there's a sort of a shortcut between learning partners. And I know that if I tell you how hard this was, you're going to understand, because you know how messy it is. When I'm talking to somebody who doesn't share the same practice, then, you know, there's all sorts of things. But I can really share my experience of something with somebody else who I see as a learning partner.
So does having that higher concept...
I wanted to add something to that.
Okay.
You know, in many organizations, they have this thing about sharing knowledge. We need to share knowledge, you know. But our experience is that best communities of practice is not like, let's sit in a circle and let's all share knowledge. And Leo, why don't you start? You know what I mean? And then when you're done, we'll go to Bev. And then when Bev's done, we'll go to it. No, good communities of practice, they work on things, you know, they work on problems.
They share their challenges rather than share their knowledge. So
Right.
they share challenges and work out ways that they can address those challenges better together than just on their own. So yes, sharing knowledge or sharing experience sends a little bit of a sort of feeling of discomfort for me, because actually it doesn't work like that. It's more, people are motivated because they have a challenge. When they go to work on Monday, they're going to have to do, they're going to have something to do. Now, with a group of people who really understand what it is that they're facing, they can work out better ways to do it.
So when we're talking about those challenges, for people to really be helpful to one another, how do they have to be present in those meetings? I mean, what does that start to look like in terms of, you know, it seems that when you're in that setting, you have to be really willing to, on one hand, really listen, and on the other hand, really give of yourself to others, and not just try to prove you're the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, I mean, how to be. I mean, Etienne has this word, selfish, productively selfish, right? So there is something about being very selfish, actually, in a community of practice. You know, it's not all kumbaya. It's being selfish. I need this to help me. And I am going to leverage, I am going to milk the knowledge of this group in order that I help myself. And so the knowledge is pulled and the learning is pulled because somebody faces an issue. So by being somebody who is ready to put their problem on the table, not what they know, but by being able to frame their problem and share their problem in a way that is also not going to send everybody off to sleep because there goes John again, all right? But so, you know, how you have to be is you have to be able to articulate a problem in a way that engages and draws other people into seeing it through your eyes and wanting to help you to make progress on it.
But there's an implied reciprocity there, though, too, right? I mean, with the idea that we're going to switch roles, maybe, because now that you've shared your problem and your challenge with me, you've got to be willing to dive in as I share my problem and challenge with you, correct?
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And it you know, it does take a certain warming up. You know, often actually the person who would break the ice is a very experienced practitioner who comes up with a challenge that they have. And then everybody goes, well, if she can have a challenge, I can have one too, because we know she's the best here. You see what I mean? So yeah, you do have to break the ice so that people see, yeah, no, this is a place where we can be really truthful about the nature. Practice is always hard because practice, we always make decisions under insufficient information. You see, we always have to do judgment calls and so on and so forth. And you deal with CEOs. It's a very hard job. You constantly are inventing on the fly and so on and so forth. It's not like there's a recipe and you just apply it and you're done, right? And so once people recognize each other as practitioners, and that becomes the kind of the rule of the norm of engagement, we engage with each other as practitioners, then there is something different that happens. There is almost like a magic that happens.
And in fact, you, Leo, in the beginning, you asked about the three key elements of the community of practice, and you started with domain. So there is a discipline of domain, which is what is it that people want to address here, but there's also the discipline of community. And that is knowing who should be at the table. Because if you have the right people around the table, reciprocity is easier because I want to hear your challenge because that talks to me. Now, if you have to have lots of rules about reciprocity, that may be because you don't have the right people around the table, because the right people around the table will be right in there with you, listening to you, empathizing with you, because they've either been through it themselves and because by listening to you, they are going to either sharpen what they know about themselves or they're going to actually find out a solution they hadn't thought of before. So the discipline of domain, the discipline of community, I mean, we call them disciplines. Yeah.
You know, what I find interesting as well is a dynamic here where, let's say that you present a challenge to the group. And as I'm listening to it, you know, just because you're the only one presenting the challenge doesn't mean that everyone else doesn't benefit from the conversation, of course. In fact, what I've seen in many CEOs who have told me that a CEO presented a challenge that was going on in their company, and they suddenly realized, I have that exact same challenge going on in my company, and I didn't even recognize it as a problem. And it's something I should really address. And I find that really fascinating in terms of the conversation. What I also think is amazing and what I think is really effective about communities of practice is that it really blends the learning with the work, the learning with the practice. They're not separate entities. you know, you've always talked about it as you can't separate knowledge from the knower or learning from the learner. And oftentimes, I think in companies today where their training regimen tends to be event oriented. Someone goes off to training and they go away for a couple of day retreat only to come back to catch up on everything they've missed and then get sucked back into their work life, where all of these valuable things they may have learned or were introduced to them in that setting, they have no mechanism for being able to apply that oftentimes in their own organization. And, you know, when we've talked about this before, and you were certainly generous contributors to the book, I think we talked a little bit about there are some organizations, and you don't have to name them necessarily if you don't want, but who have been pretty effective at communities of practice inside their own organizations to that end. Is that fair?
Yeah, so absolutely. But I wanted to go back, because we are talking about the discipline of domain, the discipline of community.
Yep.
We were talking about the discipline of practice, and that's where a community of practice is really different from a conference or an event, because a community of practice has a life over time. So if you have comes up with some agreement on what you should do, right? This is not the end. This is not the end of the learning. The learning goes on because you go back, you try it, it works, or maybe it doesn't, and you come back and you say, you know, I tried that thing and it was a disaster.
That's right.
What do you think happened? You see? So it's a loop over time between engagement in a learning partnership and engagement in practice. So for us, learning is not just, oh, I share my knowledge with you, learning is finished. No, it's we thought about something together. Let's go try it. And let's come back with the result. And that loop, that ongoing loop, is really for us where the key to learning is, you know, because we have some good conversations, but that's not the end of it. It goes into practice and it comes back, you see. It's really important. If you are a good community member, you always bring back to the community the effect of what the community has done for you, because that's how the community learns. You know, oh, you did that with that thing we said last month. That's a great idea. I never thought of it. I'm going to try it too. You see what I mean? It's like that loop has to always be there. And that's an important defining aspect of the community of practice.
No, it certainly is. And it's another aspect of the kind of culture of accountability among group members, that they are there, you know, for one another, and to, you know, and for example, Beverly, you talked about if you bring a challenge to the group and you talk about what you're going to do, you know, a few months later, people want to know, how did that work out for you? In the hope that you didn't waste everyone's time by not even addressing it in the organization at all. But you know, I think when it comes to, you know, learning, whether it's inside companies or outside companies, people want to be able today, as you know, to be able to measure learning outcomes and what it means. You know, what's the return on investment for that time I spent with my or in my community of practice, and what is it doing? I know you've done some work recently looking at learning outcomes and trying to provide some measure to that. If you could tell us about that, that would be great. I'm sure it'd be a lot of great interest to a lot of CEOs out there who are looking to, you know, they're spending billions of dollars, as you know, in U.S. corporations today on executive training and development and all, and they need to have a better understanding, I think, of you know, what their ROI is.
Right. Yeah, actually, because I think it's important to continue with your question before. Yeah. So in many organizations today, communities of practice have become part of life, if you will, in a sense that people belong to a team where they do a certain job, but they also belong to a community of practice where they can get help and develop together the capacity required to do the job. And we've worked with communities, with organizations in all sorts of sectors. Actually, interestingly, studied with business. Business were the first places where they used communities of practice as a way to develop internal capacity. I think studied probably in the oil industry. They were the first pioneer because they have very technical challenges, and you have people all over the world working on different rigs and stuff like this who need to connect and help each other with those challenges. So I think it started mostly in technical companies, but it has moved now also to service organizations, and more recently, a lot of our work have been in international development, where from this idea that the North knows and the South doesn't. Why don't we bring people together from different parts of the world to learn together how to address some of those difficult challenges? So it's interesting how the wave has sort of moved across sectors. There's also some interest in education now, in the health sector.
I just like that we're thinking about learning as a social experience. When I grew up and I was in school, collaborating with another student was called cheating. And so it's actually nice today to feel as if people can, because learning is a social experience. I mean, it really is. And we all learn better when we learn together. And certainly, very evident in a community of practice when you see successful communities of practice at work.
I was going to sort of combine two answers, because you asked us about places where we've seen it work, and also about the framework for monitoring the value of community practice, but with a sort of slight twist to it here, which is there's an organization that we've worked with called the Center of Excellence in Finance. They're based in Slovenia, and actually they're meant to serve Eastern Europe, the Baltic regions in training them or upping the capacity for finance, for knowing about finance at a government level, right? And they've taken really a community of practice or a social learning approach, right? So what was originally set up, or what was originally envisaged, was a sort of a training institute. And so they would train people in the region who would get better at it. But they decided to take a learning approach, right? So rather than focus on the content, although they do have the content because they have IMF people who are knowledge experts, they decided to train their organization in the people, and recruit and train their people in becoming good at learning and at helping others to learn. And so they now do, with their training, they have workshops which are done in combination between somebody from the IMF and one of their learning experts. And they take this sort of social learning approach, and they teach, they do their training as if it were a community of practice, more in the sort of community practice way. But what I think is interesting is that they then, and they collect data. This is now getting onto the measuring bit. They collect data about how people enjoy the courses. They collect data about the good ideas, the new knowledge that is created from those courses. But they collect two other types of data too. They follow those people who have done the course, and they interview them a few months later and then about a year later to say, how did you, what did you put into practice? How did it change your practice, and to what effect? And then they bring those stories back into their workshops.
Sure.
So you can see they've got that loop going, that social learning loop going out into practice and back again. And what's more is that they get past members who have done the workshop to come back and also co-facilitate, so that they can also say, I did this workshop, this is what I found useful, this is what I put into practice, this was the result, whether it worked or not. Okay.
And presumably it would be a reinforcing social loop, right? Because the more you do it and the more that gets reinforced, the greater the performance over time.
That's right.
Yeah, but you see, the reason why this is important in that framework that we're developing is that you need to have two kinds of data. You need to have data about the effect of the community. But because the effect of a community could be attributed to all sorts of other factors. Let's say, we have better retention in our big accounts, right? Well, that's something you can measure, but how much of this is due to the conversation in the big account sales community, right? You need to have some stories that connect a big account that was retained because of an idea that came out of the community. So you have to have it's a story genre. We call it a value creation story. It's a story that says, oh, we had this great conversation about how to renew a big account. And somebody says, if you say this and that, it has a better chance. I tried it with the customer, and the customer responded like that. I brought it back to the community, and so on and so forth. And so you want to have a story that links an activity in the community to some effect in the world. Because the value of the community is often not inside the community, although it can be also, like to be among friends is a good thing, right? But the value also has to travel outside of the community, and to follow that, we have developed a genre of stories that you need to collect to connect the community to actual effects in the world, whether it's in terms of better performance of the organizations or better performance of the members.
No, that's so great. And what I want to do too, though, is just one last thing before we wrap up, is learning in landscapes of practice is kind of an evolution to the original concept. If you could tell us a little bit about that and where you think we're headed there.
Well, I mean, how that came about is that because we are consultants, and so more and more over the last years, our work has come from people, from organizations who were trying to share a common, to make progress in the field or or to address an issue, but where the people who need to come together in order to address that issue are not necessarily obvious learning partners. It's easy if you're a group of engineers or a group of so-and-sos, then that made a very obvious community of practice. So organizations more and more needing people who didn't obviously see themselves as learning partners to come together to address it. And so a community of practice itself is not big enough to account for bringing people together across what we call the landscape, where in a landscape where you've got multiple communities of practice, right? And if you've got multiple communities of practice, you've also got boundaries, around the edge of a community of practice and between those community of practice. Very often those are very deep boundaries, disciplinary, academic, culturally, there may be boundaries between them. So when you bring people together, even though they are all trying to solve a common issue, they may have historic boundaries between them, which also need to be resolved. So you need to address the community of practice both in terms of its share and also the boundaries that exist there. So you need to turn those boundaries into learning assets, right? Because boundaries, building bridges or having conversations across boundaries are also ways of moving the conversation forward.
If you think of an organization as a landscape of practice, right? So you want to have very good engineers. So you want to have very good communities of practice of engineers. You want to have very good salespeople. But the fact that the salespeople are very good and the engineers are very good, sometimes not enough. Because sometimes there has to be some kind of conversations between them. Or maybe even some kind of community of practice between them. So whatever happens in the boundary, you need to decide if it's just a temporary encounter. But the learning capacity of the organization, it's not enough to just focus on single communities of practice. You need to focus on where are there like boundaries, like Beverly was saying, that kind of create a missed learning opportunity because people don't talk across that boundaries. So now when we work with clients, we recommend to say, look at the whole thing. You still have to have good communities of practice. Your engineers' skills have to be good. There's no question about that. But I think that's understood now in many organizations. What's not understood is, let's look at the landscape of the organization and see how the overall learning capacity is supported. So that's
It's such a great point. And I think in life in general, we all tend to oftentimes and too often to hang around with people just like us, people who agree with us, people who tend to operate in the same space, when we have so much to learn from people who, from all different walks of life, who have so much to teach us. And I think in this year of the peer, where we're trying to get people, I think, to listen more than they talk, to learn from others as opposed to being judgmental about what their whatever opinion they may have. We're obviously coming off a very divisive presidential election where it's time for everyone to take a breath and maybe start listening to one another better. But I think going into 2017, whether you're leading a company today or whether you're a business leader that wants to learn and wants to get better, if each of you could maybe offer just a couple of final thoughts on that particular point, any advice you may have would be great.
Well, for us, we are developing a concept of a learning citizen.
Yes.
Which is someone who is really using who they are as a vehicle for enabling learning around them, not just their own learning, which is important, but also enabling learning around them. Maybe crossing a boundary, maybe talking to someone whose view would be kind of, oh, this is the way you think. So this idea that each of us is potentially a learning citizen.
And related to that is, yes, developing this, developing a learning ethic. It would be, so that's, yeah. How do we develop a learning ethic that what we do is contributing to the learning, yes, of ourselves, of the people around us, and of the world.
Well, being a learning citizen and being ethical while we do so is great parting words, I think, for today. I can't thank you enough for being on the show and joining us today. So anyway, hope you do well. Have a wonderful rest of 2017, and we will connect with you soon.
Okay. Sounds
Thanks,
good.
Leo.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today. To learn more about Peer Advantage, to submit questions to Leo and our guest, and to subscribe to the Year of the Peer podcast, please visit us at leobottary.com. It's leobottary.com. This podcast is produced by me, Randy Cantrell, hosted, of course, by Leo Bottary. Music provided by Kevin MacLeod, Vibe Ace. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license.